let me start with just a little story that's happened to me in the last couple of weeks. And at the end, I'll come back to this story and perhaps, if I can remember, try to use it to try and help illustrate why you might want to implement the best practices. So I have been advising a public sector body running a classic construction competitive process. The bid deadline came in. We got 3 bids, nice looking bids. It's a multi-million-dollar project to build a facility. And the day after those 3 bids came in, we had some supplemental information come in. Who are your subcontractors? And just some kind of other detail. And in the course of submitting that extra detail the day after the bids came in, we got an amendment to the bid price that was in trying to lower the price by $230-some thousand. And so the evaluation team found this very attractive. And so they talked to me after they'd done all their own thinking about, can we entertain and look at this adjustment to the bid? It's very attractive to us. So I'll leave that with you. You can mull over that as I'm talking. And then at the end of my remarks, A, time permitting, and B, if I remember, I'll try and tell you what I thought about that. Now, I have to multitask here. So, okay, so what is procurement? Quite simply, it's the art of buying stuff, and all of you know better than I do what kind of stuff your organizations buy, and whether it's gravel or repair and maintenance or new roofs or new buildings or hiring engineers or architects. It's just the art of buying stuff. You know that. You don't need me to tell you about it. But what is procurement in the public sector? It's about buying stuff and complying with process expectations. So it's buying stuff and complying with process, and that's what this is all about. It's all about process. And it appears complicated, and it is sadly getting more complicated. But that's what public sector procurement is. Let me use the analogy of playing hockey. A few of you look like you might have played a little shinny out on the the pond or the out in the pond. And you know how to play hockey. You know how to have a little bit of fun. But it's another thing to go and play in the WHL or the SJHL and then know all the rules. And then they keep changing the rules over the years, or they keep experimenting with the rules. The point is, everybody can go out and play hockey and have a little fun, play a little shinny, play in an adult safe league, etc. Doesn't mean you necessarily know all the rules. And so I think in the world of procurement, your organizations have lots of people in them. You are buying stuff. That's a given. Your municipalities wouldn't operate if there wasn't stuff being bought. So you're buying stuff, yes. You're playing hockey, yes. But are you playing by the rules all the time? That's the issue. And from my experience, not always. The third idea about what is procurement, and again, what is procurement in the public sector, the third little idea I have is it's really about effective decision making. And so you buy stuff, you know the rules, but at the end of the day, it's really about exercising good judgment for the right reasons to pick the right solution, the right bid, and that is what kind of public sector procurement is about in my judgment. Let me just back up me. Yeah, okay. So this little picture, I'm a lawyer, I'm not very good at graphics. You can just figure that out by what you see up there, but that's as good as it gets. So here's the, I gave a half-day presentation yesterday in High River, Alberta, delightful little place, and I was looking at their public purchasing policy, and here's what it says, quote, "The town of High River is committed to fair, equitable, and competitive procurement practices." Motherhood and apple pie, bang on, everybody should say that, and that's that public process objectives you see on the right hand of that slide. Later on, they said in the same opening page of their policy, quote, "The purpose is to minimize operational costs, duplication of effort, and procurement delays, to avoid loss of reputation. Good, all good stuff. So what you have are what I would describe as a competing set of procurement objectives. On the one hand, you're trying to pursue cost-effective, best value, be efficient. How many people have 25 employees in your procurement department that do procurement, nothing but that full-time, and know all those process objectives? Anybody? No, no. So on the one hand, you've got these process objectives, Exhibit A, and on the other hand, you've got the need to do it efficiently and effectively with probably fewer than the optimal number of people in your organization. So it's a balancing act. Story alert. The city of Kelowna in 2011 decided they too wanted to buy meters, not smart meters in their case, but water meters. So they ran a nice competitive process to buy water meters. They got 3 bids, and they had presumably a good, solid evaluation strategy, and they had really a 2-step evaluation. Step 1, evaluate on technical merit. Step 2, evaluate price. And they had a rule in their procurement that said you don't get to step 2, price, unless you got 75 points out of 100 on step 1. 3 bids, step 1 in the evaluation process, oops, only 1 made it over 75 points. So you had 2 out of 3 bids not being evaluated on price, and the one of those unsuccessful bidders happened to be $2 million cheaper than the one bid that went over. So the bid that was technically above the threshold was $11 million. The next bid below the threshold was $9 million. And of course, they're unhappy, they lost. By definition, anybody who loses a competitive process is unhappy, that's a given. So they're looking for ways to challenge that bid procurement process. And you know, because they say, look, if I can find anything to hang my hat on, I got a real shot because I was lower. And so they, you know, they started a complaint, sued the city of Kelowna, and complained about the process. Ultimately, I think I'll come back to that story later, but you know, my little message here is that any process that kicks 2 out of 3 bids out of the evaluation process too early is probably flawed. Probably flawed, because what's the point of running a competitive process when you've only, to get to a point where you've only got 1 bid standing? It makes selection easy. Yes, it's kind of like the image is almost a Survivor, a season of Survivor. Who's left standing at the end? They must be the winner. That might work and make for good TV, but it doesn't really advance public policy. It means you don't get to kind of look at that $9 million bid, because it's not whether it's the best bid or the cheapest bid, it's whether, under the right circumstances, it's the best combination of value. A little closer to home, there was a Saskatchewan city in the year 2000 that needed to buy some steel pipe to twin their pipeline to their water source. They got 3 bids in. One of those bids was from a pipe mill steel manufacturer just north of the city here. The other one was from Oregon, and another one was from someplace I forgot. 3 bids in. The city ran the evaluation and concluded that 2 of those bids were non-compliant, didn't follow the process, and again, they had to kick 2 out of 3 bids out. Sadly, one of the bids that they kicked out was from that pipe manufacturer just north of the city, used to be known as IPSCO, now Evraz. And again, sadly, that bid was $1 million cheaper than the Oregon bid, but the Oregon bid was the only bid that kind of followed all the process rules. They got all the process right. They were the only bid standing, i.e. survivor model, so they got the bid. $1 million more, not even, you know, you got to ship it in from Oregon. Does that always make good policy? Not always. Sometimes it's the right decision. And the people running those bids, in my judgment, from what I know, they followed the process that they set out. The question is, did they design the right process in the first place? Because in public procurement, once you've set a process, the expectation is you're going to follow it. So the challenge is to think critically and strategically about the process in the first instance, about whether you really do need kind of all of those kind of traps or challenges that are designed to kick people out, as opposed to thinking about keeping people in the process. So, still in the zone of procurement overview, in my experience, every procurement basically has 6 buckets of criteria or things that you're going to evaluate. The scope of the work, the contract terms and risk allocation. You noticed I put that one second. I'm a lawyer. I'm biased, so mea culpa. Third, the vendor qualifications, experience, and then those last 3, you know this, price, schedule, and quality. So pretty much every procurement out there it's trying to figure out, what do I want, categorized in one fashion or another along those 6 lines. And ultimately, everything affects price. So the more scope you want, the more whatever, of course, the price goes up. You know that. What's a little less obvious is the contract terms. The more risk that you want the contractor to absorb, the price goes up. So for example, if you want, in a construction contract, you want the contractor to give you a 2-year warranty and not a 1-year warranty, guess what? He's going to increase the price. So risk equals price. And then the reason I highlighted those last 3 variables, price, schedule, and quality, businessmen years ago, early on in my career, told me that in business, those are the same 3 variables that apply to any business transaction. And the answer, or his wisdom, and to me in about my 2nd year, was you can have any 2 of those. Pick the 2 you want. And you can optimize any 2 of them, and I see at least a couple of heads shaking. And there's truth to that. If you want it fast and cheap, guess what? You're not going to get the best quality in the world. Now, I can assure you that no client of mine has ever come to me and said, let's design a procurement and I want it fast and cheap, or I want it fast and quick, so I'm prepared to live with cheap. They just, nobody will say that. They'll say, well, I want to optimize those 3, and so be it. Evaluating, remember I said earlier that effective decision-making as part of the public procurement is, that's trying to look at those variables and decide what you want and then how to pick the best one of those for your project. So in the space of public procurement, there are really 4 main ways in which your organizations buy things. Tender, request for proposals, request for quotations, and sole source. Sadly, these terms are not scientifically defined. Everybody kind of thinks they know what they mean. Everybody uses them interchangeably, and they mean different things in different contexts. And when I review your purchasing policies, that those communities which have published them, I just see the kind of overlap and the sometimes inconsistencies in the way those policy documents talk about these things. What I've put up on this slide and the next is my system of taxonomy, the way which I refer to these terms and what I think they mean. Let me just talk about them briefly. You'll have my sense of what I think they should mean. Doesn't mean that others that use them that you're engaged with in your kind of spheres of responsibility will use them the same way, but it'll perhaps arm you to ask some questions. So a tender is a competitive process. So competition is good. Tenders create competitive processes. You invite bids to compete for the work. The question about how you invite bids, in the world of public procurement, you should advertise on SAS tenders. The second and third bullet on that slide are really about what rules apply to tenders. The law of competitive bidding applies to tenders, and the trade agreements apply to tenders. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about that in a couple of slides. The idea of tenders is that they're very formal, very rigid, and historically and ideally, there's only one variable, price. So you've locked everything else down. You've locked the schedule down, you've locked the contract terms down, you've locked the scope of work down, and you've invited a competition on one variable only. It's called price. And so the theory of the tender is that you're replacing negotiation. When you negotiate, everything's in flux. How do I get the best value? But when you want to run a competition, best if you only have one variable. Now, compare and contrast that to RFP, request for proposals. It's still a competitive process. In the public sector, you still want to publicly advertise RFPs. You still want to post it on SAS tenders. I'll tell you why. The answer is because the trade agreements say you ought to. Now, here's how it distinguishes. The law of competitive bidding, in my judgment, ought not to apply to an RFP, but the trade agreements do. I'm going to say to you a couple of times, trade agreements are a body of rules. The law of competitive bidding is a body of rules. Two different bodies of rules applied to different contexts. RFPs, more things are in play, more variables are in play. You're trying to find the best solution. You're trying to evaluate on multiple variables. Therefore, you can't have a pure price competition in an RFP, and that's the difference with ideally, that's the difference with a tender. Next page, request for quotations. Most of your procurement policies will talk about RFQs. Again, they're competitive processes, but the degree of competition is different. You don't need to publish an RFQ on SAS tenders so it goes out to the whole world, but you still want to go get multiple bids, and so many of your procurement policies will have must get 3 bids to do this work. So that's a request for quotation. Now, to distinguish an RFQ from an RFP and a tender, the law of competitive bidding ought not to apply to an RFQ, and the trade agreements ought not to apply to an RFQ if you're doing it in accordance with my classification system, and I'll talk to you about that in a couple of slides as well. And again, an RFQ is optimizing flexibility. In the trade agreements, there are dollar thresholds. I'll tell you about those in a minute. And the idea, ultimately, is that RFQs can be used below those dollar thresholds so that you can minimize your compliance risks. Exhibit A, compliance risk. RFQ below the dollar threshold, most of that doesn't apply, and that's one of the ways you're minimizing risks. Sole source is, another example of the way your organizations buy stuff, and that's when there's no competition. You're either in a hurry or there's only one person in your marketplace that can supply it, and so you're just going out and buying that thing from the one organization. And when you're doing that, there's no public advertising. The trade agreement rules are not expected to apply, and hopefully you got that right. The law of competitive bidding isn't intended to apply. Now, you might have internal policy as to when your organizations can use sole source. It's obviously not creating competition, and there are circumstances where that can be abused, and your organizations want to have clear guidance to manage that effectively. One of the things I didn't put up on the slide was standing offers. Standing offers are a great tool for kind of lining up kind of organizations that can supply goods and services with minimal of rigmarole. So the process of getting people lined up under a standing offer should be subject to a competitive process, but once you've got them in place, you can use them for the duration of the standing offer. So let me transition. So that was my procurement overview, Procurement 101 in a whirlwind. I'm going to switch and talk a little bit now about the procurement rules. So I've got on that slide 6 different sources of rules that apply to public sector procurement. And again, the one shaded in blue at the top of that slide, those are the kind of most critical, the ones that have the kind of most significant consequences for your organization. Trade agreements, we'll talk about in a second, but again, they apply to public sector bodies. They don't apply to private sector, they don't apply to Mosaic, they don't apply to K+S or PCS, they just apply to the public sector, from the federal government to the provincial government to cities to school boards to health regions. The law of competitive bidding, on the other hand, is a body of law that applies to the public sector and the private sector when you're running a true tender. So if you're running a true competitive tender, that body of law applies to you, whether public or private. Administrative law applies only to the public sector. The Freedom of Information legislation applies only to the public sector. And the part that's challenging is that these bodies of rules are not coherent. They're not a tight, integrated body of rules that you can make perfect sense of. If you could, it wouldn't have taken that long. And maybe the best analogy I can come up with is it's like football. You can play football in the CFL and you got one set of rules. You can play football in the NFL and you got a different set of rules. It's football, it's just different rules. So again, in public procurement, there are different rules for different reasons. The last thing on that list, internal policies and procedures. So yes, most of your organizations have policies and procedures. You don't get sued for not complying with your policies and procedures by unsuccessful bidders, generally. Your employees, if there's any people here who are employees of municipalities, if you don't follow the policies and procedures, you might get into trouble, you might get disciplined, you could even get fired. So there are consequences to employees. The other thing that's maybe worth noting, not all of the obligations in these bodies of rules are really legally enforceable. Sometimes they're more akin to expectations or best practices. So, an example of that is if you're driving in a snowstorm, it's good practice to put your four-way flashers on. There's no rule that says you have to drive in a snowstorm with your four-way flashers on, but it's a good idea. There's lots of good ideas in the world of procurement, good practices. They're not necessarily legally enforceable. So, the trade agreements. This is a slide that summarizes some of the key trade agreement obligations. So there's 2 trade agreements out there. The Agreement on Internal Trade, it's a trade agreement between the federal government and the 10 provinces. It was signed in 1990, and none of your municipalities signed the trade agreement. But you're still expected to follow it. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. The second trade agreement is something called the New West Partnership Trade Agreement, affectionately known as NUWEPTA. And it was signed in 2010, and the New West Partnership Trade Agreement is between the province of Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC. And again, these 2 trade agreements are not coherent in the sense that they take different approaches to the same issues. I'll point out a few examples, but you've got 2 trade agreements with conflicting expectations, and so you're stuck complying with the lowest common denominator. The interesting point about the trade agreements is that they were originally, they're trade agreements. Their goal is to reduce barriers to trade. So the philosophy is that competition is good. The bigger the field of competitors, better. And so we ought to let businesses from Manitoba and BC and Ontario and Quebec and Alberta come in and compete for every piece of government work. That's the theory behind the trade agreements. And we've created remedies or solutions to enable, bidders from Alberta to complain against our governments and against municipalities when you don't abide by the trade agreement obligations. So the 5 or 6 points on this slide are the essence of the trade agreement obligations. The first one, open access. So what open access is, it's about advertising. And the way in which your organization is intended to meet its primary trade agreement obligation is to tell the country that you're out buying something. It's all well and good to have a trade agreement obligation and believe in competition, but if you keep it a secret and only publish in your local paper, who in Alberta or Quebec or Ontario or Nova Scotia is going to find out about it? So the expectation is that you're going to have open access and you're going to advertise your procurements. And in Saskatchewan, you're obligated to advertise on something called SAS tenders. And when you put it on SAS tenders, you're fulfilling your open access obligations. Now, you don't have to put all your tenders and RFPs, all your competitions on SAS tenders, just the ones that you're required to, and I'll answer that in a second. The second element of the trade agreement is you can't have any discrimination. So if you do post your competitive procurement on SAS tenders and you get bids in from Alberta, you can't say, well, I got a local preference, I'm just going to ignore that bid from Alberta. That would be offside your no discrimination expectations. So these first two rules, and these are about as close to kind of black letter rules as you'll find in the trade agreement, advertise, no discrimination based on out-of-province bidders. Those are your two primary obligations. That's the heart of the trade policy objective. But the trade agreements don't stop there. The trade agreements go on to say, to impose a fairness obligation. You're supposed to treat all bidders fairly. You're supposed to minimize sole source. So the trade agreements actually minimize the opportunities that you have to purchase by sole source. Emergencies, unforeseen emergencies would be one example. Buying certain professional services, we'll talk about in a minute, and below the dollar thresholds. Below the dollar thresholds that I'll show you in a minute, you can do anything you want. The dollar thresholds are pretty low. So another part of the rules of the trade agreements. In addition to fairness, what the trade agreements say is that you're supposed to articulate your evaluation criteria. And in addition to not only articulating the evaluation criteria, you're supposed to disclose the method of evaluating. And this is where all this complexity starts to come in, is the art and science of figuring out what your evaluation criteria are going to be, figuring out how you're going to conduct the evaluation. That is what the trade agreements impose upon you, and that's where a lot of the complexity comes in. The overriding aim of these trade agreements is open access and no discrimination and fairness. And sadly, these trade agreements are often observed in the breach. The lower down the food chain your municipality goes in terms of size, number of people, the less familiar you are with this stuff. And it's somewhat understandable if you don't have, full-time procurement agents who are going to training sessions and familiar with these principles. It's just hard for your organizations to know and understand the rules and follow them. So again, your organizations are procuring stuff all the time. Whether you're playing by the rules is another matter. So this slide is telling you about those thresholds, the dollar thresholds in the trade agreements. So for NUEPTA, the thresholds are $75,000 for goods and services, or $200,000 for construction. So if your project is above those dollar thresholds, you must abide by the rules. The key rules being you must post on SAS tenders, and you can't discriminate against out-of-province bids. If you were playing by the AIT, the Agreement on Internal Trade, that's the federal trade agreement involving all 10 provinces. Shockingly, there are a different set of dollar thresholds. And so when I said earlier, there's a lack of coherence, it's hard to understand why these dollar values don't line up, but you're basically hooped to go by and play by the lower dollar thresholds. So the point is that below these dollar thresholds, you don't have to post on SAS tenders. You're free to have local preferences if you want them. And let me digress here. Local preference, many of your procurement policies actually articulate a local preference. And I meant to capture this one out of High River. Quote, preference is given to local firms and the procurement of Canadian goods and services from local firms. Many of your municipalities have that idea as well. And my point is that below the dollar threshold, it's okay to have a local preference. Above the dollar threshold, it's not okay to have a local preference. Above the dollar threshold, you need to be a little more nuanced about how you plan your evaluation. You ought not to articulate local preferences, but it's not to prevent you from thinking about the importance of some other things like local experience. So local experience in a construction context might be, do you know who the sub-trades are in your area? Do you know how to work with the local municipal building department? Do you know the ground soil conditions in this area? Those are examples of local experience. And when you're running a competition above the dollar threshold so the trade agreements apply, don't ask for local preference, but if you're thoughtful about it, you might be able to articulate some local value add that you can then take into account. Or, what's the ability to perform warranty and servicing work if you want a minimum response time. If it's important and it's relevant, you can build that into your procurement. Now, I throw that out there as something to consider. It should only be used when you can justify it as being relevant to the procurement. So back to the dollar thresholds. So below the thresholds, there's nothing in the trade agreements that prohibits a local preference. And if you want a local preference below those thresholds, you're free to articulate it. These dollar thresholds, you're not supposed to manipulate your purchases to artificially divide them to get below the threshold. So if you're buying a grader that's going to be $100,000, you can't kind of remove the wheels and the blades and buy those separately. That would just be manipulating the process. If you are going to buy, over the course of a year, 2 or 3 different groups of maintenance services from your plumbing contractor, if the aggregate of all the purchases from a contractor are going to exceed $75,000 for the year, that doesn't mean that you have to comply with the trade agreements. You look at it on a procurement by procurement. Now again, if you know you've got $100,000 worth of work in one building and you've got the budget and you're committed to doing it all, you can't divide that artificially up and try to get below these trade agreement thresholds. But if in the middle of January you have a problem with your sewer and you find a contractor that is a $10,000 fix, you don't have to comply with the trade obligations on that one procurement, even though later in the year there might be other procurements that you can reasonably anticipate but aren't part of that particular contract. So you don't have to look at your annual spend on plumbers and say, oh, it's over $75,000 in aggregate, therefore I have to try and run a procurement posted on SAS tenders each and every time. I mentioned that the trade agreements, there are some exemptions to the trade agreements. So again, below the dollar thresholds, you're exempt from the trade agreements. Some of the other typical exemptions are where only one supplier can meet the procurement, where there's an emergency. If your kind of curling rink burns down and you've got to get somebody in to knock it down because it's a health and safety hazard, you just do that. Or if you've got to get fencing put up around it to keep everybody out of it, again, you just do that because it's an emergency and you don't have to comply with the trade agreements. Shockingly, if you're hiring legal services, you don't need to comply with the trade agreements. And the logic for that is that there are certain relationships and services that are trust-based relationships, and how do you run a competition where the criteria is trust? And so legal services have happily been carved out. If you wanted to fire your chief administrative officer, it'd be a little awkward to have to post on SAS tenders. We need a lawyer who's real good in labor and employment law because we're going to be firing our CAO, and so we need to find the right lawyer. That would be kind of telegraphing some confidential business strategy. Now, here's an example of another lack of coherence between AIT and NUEPTA. AIT also came to the view that working with engineers, architects, accountants, those also were trust-based relationships, and you didn't need to go and comply with the trade agreement obligations to hire those kinds of professionals. So again, what does that mean? You don't have to post it on MERCs or SAS tenders, and you can discriminate. You can hire local professionals. Again, part of the rationale behind that would be, every province, every jurisdiction has its own building codes, its own, professional bylaws, and who's best going to know that is architects and engineers in Saskatchewan, not the ones in Alberta. But the people who put NUEPTA together obviously came to a different policy consideration. They came to the view that engineers, architects, accountants didn't need any kind of different set of rules than hiring, plumbers or buying golf carts or buying gravel. So under NUEPTA, when you're hiring professional services other than lawyers, you're supposed to comply with the trade agreement rules if it's above the dollar thresholds. So again, that's an example of a lack of coherence between these bodies of rules. So here's an example. Here's just a page shot or a screenshot of what SAS tenders looks like. I'm not sure that's in focus or if you can read it, but it's just it's a website hosted by the provincial government where your tenders get posted when required. Each province has their own version of this. Alberta, it's called the Alberta Purchasing Connection. The federal government has their own version of this. It's called MERCs. A lot of your purchasing policies still refer to posting on MERCs, not SAS tenders. SAS tenders hasn't been around all that long, but once it came into kind of being, the province and the New West Partnership Trade Agreement say you got to post on SAS tenders. You're free to post on MERCs, but you're required to post on SAS tenders. So I mentioned that your municipalities did not sign these trade agreements, yet you're expected to comply with them. And the reason that you're expected to comply with them is because the province signed the trade agreements on your behalf. And then eventually, this just happened, I think within the last year and a half, is the province embedded in the municipalities legislation. So in the Cities Act and the Municipalities Act, they put these little provisions into the legislation. And that fourth bullet there says purchasing policy and all purchases must be in accordance with the trade agreements. So the province is embedded in your governing legislation as municipalities that thou shalt comply with the trade agreements, even though they're incoherent sometimes. So in complying with the trade agreements, you're going to hire engineers. Which one do you comply with? The AIT that says you don't have to post publicly to hire engineers, or NUEPTA that says you do. So figure it out. You have to comply with both, which in essence means you comply with NUEPTA because it's the more onerous. Interesting, in the first bullet, the Cities Act was amended to say you must establish a purchasing policy, whereas for the Municipalities Act, which governs towns and resort villages and hamlets, it says you may establish a purchasing policy. The third bullet says, in effect, if you do have a purchasing policy, though, it needs to be compliant with the trade agreements, and then your organization must comply with it. Now, interestingly, this kind of rule doesn't exist in other provinces. So there's no rule like this in Alberta and BC. And BC even went so far as to put in some legislation that you cannot get sued in BC for breaching the NUEPTA. And they did that because, NUEPTA, it's more of a policy guideline and an aspirational statement as opposed to firm, hard rules. And so they saw fit to say, well, look, we don't want our organizations in the public sector getting sued over the NUEPTA policy guidelines. I like to use this little funny analogy. Has anybody ever driven in India? There's lots of traffic signs, but nobody follows them. They're suggestions. They're just suggestions, and you follow them at your peril. I think that's what BC has figured out with NUEPTA. So that's a kind of quick, high-level overview of the trade agreement rules. And remember, I said that's just one body of rules. The second body of rules, and it's called the Law of Competitive Bidding. And this applies to both the public sector and the private sector. And what it's basically done is turned the process of running a tender into a contractual process. And they call that the bid contract. So when you put a tender out in the public domain, whether you're K+S or the City of Moose Jaw, and you say, I'm running a competition on price, and if you submit the bids, the low price is going to win. If you set up that kind of process and you say your bids must be irrevocable for 60 days for me to evaluate and decide which one I'm going to take, and if you say, and you got to give me a bid bond, bid deposit as security, if you say all those things, you've effectively created a contractual process. And the courts have said that if you run that kind of process and you don't do it right, you can get sued by the unsuccessful bidders. So in the law of competitive bidding, there are really two contracts. There's the contract that governs the process, the bid contract, and then there's the contract that the winning bidder gets to build the potash mine, to build the school. That's called the performance contract. And the reason that they did this was we all understand that when you submit your bid into a formal process where the expectation is that low price wins and where the expectation is that that bid is going to be open for 60 days to be accepted, we all think that it's fair that if you get your bid selected, you ought to enter into the contract. And so what happened in 1981 in a case called Ron Engineering that went to the Supreme Court of Canada, that was the kind of process that was run. The winning bidder who was selected decided for some good reason, I imagine they concluded they either underbid and they were going to lose money, or they made a mistake in the calculation of their bid, but they said, oops, I don't want to enter into this contract, and so they refused to enter into the contract. They were probably prepared to forfeit their bid bond, the deposit, but they really didn't want to enter into the contract. And the court needed to come up with a kind of principled analysis, a way of looking at saying, no, you must enter into the contract, or be liable for the damages that the public body is going to suffer. So if the winning bid in my example is $10 million, but that bidder refuses to enter into the contract, and the next bid is $12 million, so the public is going to go and give the contract to bidder number 2, but it's going to cost them $2 million more. The courts wanted to create the environment where the tender calling authority can sue that bidder for the $2 million, and the only way they could imagine doing that was to create this bid contract process. And so, the obligation, so in any contract, there's rights and obligations on both parties. That's the definition of a contract. You got to have rights and obligations going both ways. And so the obligations on the bidders are real simple. Your bid's irrevocable for the time period in the invitation. You must enter into the performance bid, or sorry, the performance contract if you're awarded, and you can't modify your bid after you've submitted them. Very precise, very clear. It's not very hard for the winning or for bidders to play by those rules. On the other hand, what are the obligations on the public sector body or the private sector? If Mosaic runs a formal tender, these are the same rules that apply to them as they would the town of Osler. So these are the obligations on the procuring organization. You got to treat all bidders fairly and equally. All bidders must be evaluated using the same criteria. Can't have any undisclosed preferences. Must not allow bids to be altered after the bid closing date, on and on and on. These are not very precise. They're subjective. They're open to interpretation, and this is where the public sector bodies can get into a lot of trouble. And you know, it's been a heyday for unsuccessful bidders since this body of law has been created. You know, public sector bodies are not suing bidders because they refuse to enter into these contracts. It's the other way around. Unsuccessful bidders are by definition unhappy. They think they ought to have won, and they think the process must have been unfair, otherwise they would have won. And so the bid contract process is being used regularly by unsuccessful bidders to sue public sector bodies. And the challenge is the obligations and expectations are evolving, and they're imprecise and they're subjective, and this is a hard body of rules and expectations to abide by. And so ideally, you should try to avoid being inside this body of rules. And it's a body of rules that you choose to be in when you choose to run a tender. And so when when you're designing your procurement processes, use this one very carefully and only when it's necessary and when you've got a real clear evaluation kind of plan. Ideally, when the only thing that you're competing on is price. If the only variable that you're competing on is price, then it's easy. Low price should win. But if you're trying to evaluate technical merit, if it's like a skating competition where you got technical merit and artistic impression, this is a bad time to run a contractual process because judging is generally too subjective, as we know from figure skating.
When someone is going to sue the entity who's pursuing the tender, what are they suing for? The profit in their losing bid? The entire amount of the bid?
So very good question. And the short answer is they can sue for lost profits. They'll also sue for the costs of preparing their bid, but it can be for lost profits, and that's why this is such a kind of beware body of rules in your procurement. And I will compare and contrast the consequences for being offside the trade agreements in a second, but it is the main reason why you want a red flag around true tenders. And lots of your procurement policies use the language of tender, and it looks like it's this body, that you're playing by this body of rules, but you're not. You're more likely and often more in a request for quotations kind of environment, but you're not being disciplined and careful enough as to the terms by which you're running your process. These other couple of bodies of rules, administrative law, again, there is a body of law out there called administrative law that applies to every decision your organization makes, whether it's handing out taxi licenses, business licenses, or making procurement decisions. The body of administrative law applies as well. It's concerned that you make, not with the quality of your decision, but that the decision that you made is made properly according to law, that it wasn't made in bad faith, that the person that got the taxi license didn't get it because they're a relative, it's not an arbitrary decision. The body of administrative law applies to procurement. It's being used more frequently, but it's probably less of a concern for many of the smaller organizations. Only when the dollars are kind of fairly significant and material are people going to go to the trouble of challenging by virtue of administrative law reasons. Freedom of information legislation is relevant to your procurement because unsuccessful bidders can use the FOI process to get the evaluation results. So they know they didn't win, they're unhappy, now they're looking for ammunition about figuring out how to throw darts. And so the starting point is, they'll come to a debriefing session. If they're not satisfied after the debrief, they'll ask for the evaluation results, and they're entitled to them. We had a client, a municipality this summer, ran a competition. They had 2 bids, one won, one lost. The one that lost wasn't happy, and they said, show us the evaluation results. So the municipality says, okay, here are your results. Here's how we evaluated you. And they said, well, that's helpful, but what I really want to know is how you evaluated the other guy. And so they said, show me that stuff. And we said, well, no, that's confidential. We're not going to do that. And they said, well, we disagree. We'd like it anyways. And so now you get into a little bun fight, and the bun fight involves applying to the privacy commissioner and making submissions, and it costs money and takes time. So FOI is an example of, responsibilities, expectations, that when your procurements and your evaluations are getting complicated and they become challenging to run, and you have disappointed bidders, this is another arrow in their quiver to find ways to challenge the decision-making processes going on in your organizations. So, consequences. This is about the claims and protests. The AIT, so this is what are the consequences when you don't follow the rules. the agreement on internal trade didn't have any meaningful consequences for public bodies other than the federal government. It had a dispute mechanism where an unhappy bidder could complain to their host province, and there would be a discussion and dialogue go on, but there would be no compensation back to the unsuccessful bidder. And if there's no compensation coming back to the unsuccessful bidder, there's really no incentive for the unsuccessful bidder to use the bid protest mechanism. And so for the last 25 years, there's only been 2 or 3 examples, leaving aside the federal government, where unsuccessful bidders have used this bid protest mechanism against a province, against a city, a town. It's just not an effective remedy because there's nothing in it for the unsuccessful bidder. The federal government, on the other hand, developed something called the Canadian International Trade Tribunal, which, as the name suggests, is used for trade disputes between the US and Canada and Mexico and Canada, where it's truly trade-related disputes. But that same tribunal also handles basic procurement disputes. So you don't have to be a US-based supplier or a Mexican-based supplier to use this tribunal. If you're based in Alberta and the federal government runs a process and you think you were not treated fairly, you can use this federal tribunal to challenge the federal government. And you can recover lost profits. So there's lots of motivation for unsuccessful bidders to use the trade tribunal to challenge evaluations in federal procurement. So in the last 2 years, the little survey I did, there was 48 disputes involving procurement and evaluation against the federal government. So 48 disputes in 2 years. It's all because the consequences, there's enough incentive. You can get your lost profits. Now, you'll see in the middle of that slide, NUEPTA and the caution flag. NUEPTA came into effect in 2010, and for the first 5 years, there were no effective remedies for being offside NUEPTA. Again, they're policy guidelines, they're expectations, best practices. You know, turn your blinkers on in a snowstorm, but nothing bad is going to happen to you if you don't, other than you might get in a small accident, but you're not getting sued. Well, in July of this year, NUEPTA was amended and updated to implement something called the bid protest mechanism. So now, if you're a BC supplier, an Alberta supplier, or a Saskatchewan supplier, you can use the bid protest mechanism against public sector bodies, including your municipalities, if a municipality doesn't follow the procurement rules, doesn't conduct the process fairly, doesn't conduct the process according to the evaluation criteria and methodology that were laid out in the bid invitation. So it's like the provinces have now painted a target on your municipal kind of sector chests and said, okay, we're now giving a tool, an arrow in the quiver of the unsuccessful bidders to fire that arrow at your organizations if the procurement wasn't run properly. So will it be effective in the hands of unsuccessful bidders? Will they start using it? Time will tell. This bid protest mechanism, it's got 2 stages to it. Stage 1, you got 20 days, and you're supposed to use, quote, every reasonable effort, end quote, to resolve the dispute with the unsuccessful bidder. So it's a consultation process. Every reasonable effort. What does that mean? I don't know. You know, does it mean, you know, having a nice chat and saying, well, maybe we made a mistake, but next time, hopefully we'll do better? Or does it mean writing them a check to cover their costs? And then the second stage, if the unsuccessful bidder isn't happy at the end of the consultation process, note to self, they probably won't be satisfied, but they can then refer the dispute to arbitration. And this is supposed to be a fast and efficient, expedient arbitration. Each province is going to have a little roster of arbitrators, and you just pick one of the arbitrators off the roster. The unsuccessful bidder makes a written submission. You make a written submission. The arbitrator reads the 2 submissions. You only have 14 days to make your submission, so do they. And 14 days later, the arbitrator gets the submissions and then within a short time frame makes a decision. And the maximum award that the arbitrator can award is $50,000 per dispute for bid development costs and up to $50,000 for costs involved in being involved in the arbitration. So you've got a $100,000 target painted on your chest. Will it become used by unsuccessful bidders? Again, time will tell, but I think in my judgment, it will prove to be anything but fast and efficient, and it will become a thorn in your side in time. So those are the remedies under the trade agreements. These are the remedies under the law of competitive bidding. We already talked about it, the red caution flag, you can get sued for lost profits. Under administrative law, if you're offside your administrative law obligations, essentially a court, an unsuccessful bidder intervenes, and the court will, if they agree, may quash the decision and ask you to go back and make a new decision. So some unsuccessful bidders they want the contract. And what they'll do is they'll say, they'll apply under administrative law to get a court to turn over your decision. So we're acting for a health region who's running a procurement, and one of the bidders, or one of the potential bidders, didn't like the way the process was designed, and they actually tried to apply to the court to get an injunction while we're in the middle of the process to stop the process and say effectively you shouldn't even be running that process. And again, if the caution to your organizations is these kinds of actions or proceedings can cost you lots of money. They can delay your procurement, and it will cause you some consternation. I should have mentioned back on the NUEPTA, the other thing that the bidders can do is they can apply in the midst of your procurement to actually postpone your procurement. So if they look at the procurement process and say, I think this is biased, I don't think there's any way I can win. They don't have to wait till they lose. They can make a complaint to you and say, I think your criteria are biased. So let's say you're in the business of needing to buy some graders. Well, if you spec the grader so that only a John Deere grader can win, of course, anybody who's in the business of selling or supplying or manufacturing Volvo graders is going to take a shot at you, and they're going to kind of perhaps try and postpone your process. So again, it's going to become a tool in the hands of the bidding community to challenge you with. So what do the disputes, procurement disputes, they're always primarily about evaluation. And either you evaluated based on some undisclosed criteria. The assertion is that you had some preferences that you didn't disclose, that you didn't follow the process that you said you would, but evaluation is at the heart of every dispute, and that's where you're at most vulnerable. Conflicts of interest are a secondary category, and in the public sector, or in municipalities in particular, because your organizations are often smaller and you have other kind of responsibilities in the community, conflicts of interest become an area of concern as well. So in the area of evaluations, on the slide, those are the evaluation complaints. And the conventional wisdom in the public sector procurement is that you should be able to fully define how you're going to select the winner, and that you're going to have fully identified evaluation criteria, and you're going to even have a scoring system for your evaluation metrics. And that is the conventional wisdom, and the trend is, as I see it, towards increasing complexity and increasing evaluation metrics. And so when you're SASC builds and you're doing a P3, a bypass, it's getting very complicated. And that procurement RFP gets posted, it gets into the public domain, and then your municipalities start looking at it. And then you start being influenced by all that complexity, and you try to cherry pick some of that into your documents. And, it's just everybody is adding complexity into their processes, and every document you look at looks like it's got a good idea, so you want to grab that idea and put it into your document, and that's what I'm seeing happening. And so it's like everybody has the power to add complexity into your procurement, but nobody's taking that complexity out. And it's that complexity that's starting to, kill the processes and leading to all these complaints. And again, I use that example of the survivor image. It's like it's getting so complex, you're just looking for one organization or one bidder that's standing at the end, and then they're the winner. In my experience, there's kind of a hubris has crept into evaluation. You can't always necessarily know how you're going to pick the winner at the start. Sometimes you need to use the process of talking to the bidders to get smarter, to know and figure out what you actually want. And so it's not, if you've done something 5 times, if you bought graders 5 years in a row, maybe you know perfectly well how to spec and buy a grader. But if this is the first time you've ever hired a construction manager and you don't really know what is important in the construction management services, you sometimes need the process of talking to 4 or 5 different construction managers to decide what's really important. The last time I hired a roofer to go and do my roofing, I talked to him, to 3 or 4 different roofers. Some of them gave me confidence, some of them made me smarter, and at the end of the day, I knew a lot better how to hire a roofer than I did at the start. And so I think it is a bit of hubris to think that you know at the start of every procurement exactly how you're going to pick the winner. But that's where the conventional wisdom is these days, is that it says it's part of your fairness expectation that you should know exactly how you're going to pick your winner, tell everybody how you're going to pick your winner, and then follow that process exactly. And I think that's where a lot of the traps come in. So I said earlier, to avoid those successful claims and lawsuits and bid protests, that what you need is a good, effective toolkit. And this is a slide about what those tools are. You need good purchasing policies. You need good purchasing procedures. Ideally, you would have, some good templates, some good requests for proposals, requests for quotations, and you'd have a good how-to guide telling your people how to do this stuff. Again, ideally, this stuff would be scaled to the complexity of your organization, and the simpler the better. And the more complicated you try to make it, I assure you, the more trouble you're going to get into, because you won't have the sophistication in your organization to use it. Again, the red caution flag is effective procurement and planning and execution. That's where the heart of your planning is. So why make this investment? This is what you need to do, but will you do it? And the reasons that the obvious reason that you might do it is you want to avoid those lawsuits. Okay, that's easy. You want to avoid the negative cost of the lawsuit. You also I think equally importantly, remember my stories at the outset about rejecting 2 out of 3 bids on the pipe mill and the pipe and the city of Kelowna and rejecting 2 out of 3 bids for the water meters. Anytime you're rejecting bids, you're missing an opportunity to take a look at an attractive bid. So if you don't have good processes and good tools and you're unnecessarily disqualifying bids, I think you run the risk of avoiding what could have been good bids. So that's a reason, and those are costing you real money. That bid from IPSCO was $1 million less. IPSCO can make good pipe. You know, there was no issue about IPSCO's pipe. They forgot the bid bond. And did the bid bond even make sense in the context of a pipe supply? The detail doesn't matter. But if you have a process, you've got to follow the process. And if your process is about kicking people out as opposed to keeping people in, it's going to cost your organization money. And I think maybe the third reason I would give you for why you want good, effective policies and procedures, and don't understand me to be saying complex. I'm trying to say practical, properly scaled, is because the time and effort it takes you to plan and execute a procurement goes up with the more complex you're trying to make it. The simpler you make it, the more efficient your organization can be in getting that bid on the street. I think I told you at the outset there was this story about the low bid, or sorry, the bid amendment coming in after the bid's closed. And just coming back to that, you know, that was a true tender. And because it was a tender, you can't, you know, my client couldn't accept the $230,000 bid amendment after the bid closing because that's offside the rules. So as attractive as accepting that price reduction would have been, and we understand, we don't know, but we assume the reduction came in because they made a mistake in how they calculated their bid price. They really meant to give us the lower price, it's just they made a mistake. But because we ran a formal tender, we couldn't accept it. On the other hand, had we conducted or designed a more flexible process that was an RFP that would have allowed some more flexibility, we could have considered potentially, but there might have been other implications of that. And so it's not that there's a black and white answer that you can never accept an amendment after bid closing. But in the case of the rules that we chose to abide by, we had to in that instance. So just to sum up, the key points I'm trying to leave you with is to keep it simple as you think about planning any particular procurement and your procurement policies and procedures. I do have very good friends who are Mennonites, and Mennonites have a long-standing philosophy of more with less. How can you do more with less? How can you design your policies and procedures and your procurements to be less complicated, not more? Because it's the complexity that trips you up. Avoid tenders, generally speaking, the ones that are subject to the law of competitive bidding. If you really do want to run a true tender, get a guide. In high-risk situation, get a guide. Use RFQs, requests for quotations wherever possible. In my judgment, they're the best combination of efficiency, competition, and the fewest number of compliance rules. I think that's essentially the presentation, and I'm happy to take questions.
Jim Winiger from the town of Dalmeny. Over the years, I've received a number of tenders, stuff like that, but the municipality always had the right to reject all tenders and to re-tender. So why wouldn't have those municipalities rejected them all and just redid it?
So the question is, I think to the example I was giving you, why wouldn't we just reject all the tenders and then start a new or essentially make a decision outside the process? So Good question. Not sure I'll have a simple answer. When you're in the law of competitive bidding, where do the rules come from? The rules come from what you write in your invitation to tender. And the point made was, we always say in tenders, we have the ability to reject all the tenders or all the bids or any bid we want, and we have the right basically to consider non-compliant bids. The problem is there's a second source of rules that you can't overcome. And the second source of rules is what the courts say. And when you're running a tender, there's a fundamental rule that the court and the Supreme Court several times has said, you cannot accept a non-compliant bid. And a non-compliant bid is a bid that's late. So you can't amend your bid after the bid closing date when you're running a formal tender subject to that bid contract. It's just a fundamental rule of the law of competitive bidding, despite whatever you might have tried to say in your invitation. So if you try to do, if you tried to consider that late bid as a legitimate amendment, you could be sued and sued successfully under the law of competitive bidding. Now, if you reserve the right to reject all the bids and stop the process and then called up that bidder who had amended their price, let's take a survey. Who thinks that's fair, just at a gut level? Who thinks that's unfair? I think it's unfair too. And so while you might do it and you might get away with it, technical legal language, get away with it under the law of competitive bidding, under administrative law principles, you're going to get challenged for an unfair decision. So if you were K+S or Mosaic, who are not subject to admin law principles, you might do it, you might get away with it, but if you're a public sector body, you're going to get caught by this other body of rules called administrative law rules, and they would say, well, that's unfair to have run a process and then canceled that process to do something that you ought not to have done inside that process.
I'm just wondering how this all this impacts with how it works with the duty to consult and accommodate, like being a northerner. How does that impact us?
So the question, how does procurement impact the duty to accommodate northern First Nations perspectives, and how does it fit within the trade agreements? So under the trade agreements, there is an ability to evaluate and take into consideration First Nations kind of business development opportunities, and that is a legitimate objective that can be factored into your evaluation. So if your municipalities have those kind of considerations in your procurement, in your region, and you want to take it into account, the trade agreements do permit it, and so that's one of the exceptions to complying with all those other rules. So you can effectively have a positive bias towards First Nations organizations that are giving favorable consideration to certain minimum amounts of Aboriginal First Nations content. So it's contemplated by the trade agreements, but it's kind of outside of the formal rules.